A camera is pointed at a man cleaning out his office. He's been CEO for 14 days. He didn't get fired for stealing. He didn't get fired for lying. He got fired for asking questions. Specifically, for asking where $1.7 billion went. This is the story of how one of Japan's most respected companies hid nearly 2 decades of financial rot behind a wall of fake deals, phantom fees, and a corporate culture so powerful it could eject a sitting CEO in less than 2 weeks. And the details of how they actually pulled it off, the mechanics, the tricks, the people in the background, those are far stranger than anything you've probably read about this. Most people know the headline, Olympus, scandal, cover-up, but the version most people know is missing the part that makes your jaw drop. Because this wasn't just a company cooking the books. This was a machine. A machine that produced fake paperwork, fake rationale, fake logic, and it ran for nearly 20 years without anyone pulling the plug. Here's what we're going to cover. First, how the scheme actually worked, not the surface version, the real mechanics. Then, who Michael Woodford was and why his presence alone was a threat before he ever asked a single question. And finally, what happened when he did ask and why the cover-up almost survived even that. Let's go. Olympus Corporation, founded in 1919, Tokyo-based, world famous for cameras and medical endoscopes. By the late 1980s, it's a legitimate global powerhouse. But behind the brand, the finance team is sitting on a problem. Olympus had been investing heavily in financial instruments, securities, funds, complex products, and in the early 1990s, when Japan's asset bubble collapsed, those investments cratered. The losses were enormous, embarrassing, potentially company-ending if disclosed. So they made a decision: don't disclose them. Now, here's where most retellings stop. They say Olympus hid the losses, and that's true. But what they don't tell you is how. Because hiding nearly $2 billion doesn't happen with a single entry in a spreadsheet. It takes architecture. It takes narrative. It takes a machine that can keep producing plausible-looking reasons for money to move year after year after year. The scheme had a name internally. It was called Tobashi. Roughly translated, it means to fly away or to make disappear. The idea was to transfer losing assets off the company's balance sheet, move them into external funds, affiliated entities, anywhere they wouldn't show up in the official financials. And then, over time, find ways to quietly absorb the losses back in without anyone noticing. That last part, absorbing the losses back in, is where it gets genuinely creative and genuinely insane. The single most underappreciated detail of this entire scandal is that the cover-up didn't rely on fake numbers. It relied on fake stories. Think about that for a second. If you just change a number in a spreadsheet, an auditor might catch it. But if you create a transaction, a real-looking acquisition, a real-looking advisory fee, a real-looking investment, then the number has a story behind it. And stories are much harder to disprove. This is what Olympus did. They called it transactional camouflage. Every time they needed to move a large sum of money to cover the hidden losses, they built a transaction around it. A company acquisition here, a consulting fee there, a payment to an advisory firm for services rendered. The advisory fees are where it gets almost surreal. In normal mergers and acquisitions, advisory fees are a real cost. Banks charge them. They're usually a percentage of the deal value, but that percentage has norms. There's a range that looks reasonable. Go outside that range and people ask questions. Olympus went so far outside that range, it wasn't even funny. In one case, Olympus paid an advisory fee on an acquisition that was so large it essentially functioned as a second purchase price. Not advice, not a service. A pipe for moving hundreds of millions of dollars to entities that would use that money to quietly retire the hidden losses. The fee was the point. The acquisition was the cover. But it gets stranger. Some of the acquisitions Olympus made during this period were for tiny companies. Businesses with no meaningful revenue, no real assets, nothing that would justify a major corporation paying attention to them. One of the most cited examples involves 3 small companies. Olympus bought a medical waste recycling firm, a microwave cookware company, and a face cream business. None of these were strategic fits for a precision optics and medical equipment giant. Olympus paid roughly $773 million for them combined, then wrote almost all of that value down as goodwill impairment within a few years. The companies were essentially worthless from a business standpoint. But from an accounting standpoint, they were incredibly useful. Here's why. Goodwill is one of the most subjective entries on a corporate balance sheet. When you buy a company, you often pay more than its tangible assets are worth. That premium gets recorded as goodwill, the value of the brand, the relationships, the strategic potential. And goodwill is notoriously hard to challenge in the moment because it's based on future projections that no one can disprove yet. So you buy a face cream company for $100 million when it's worth $5 million, you record $95 million in goodwill, you write it down later, and somewhere in that transaction, tens of millions in hidden losses got absorbed into the accounting fog. You don't need fake invoices if you can buy intangibles that no one can price objectively. That's the insight. That's the machine. But the machine needed operators, and it needed a specific environment to run in. Japan's accounting standards in the 1990s were, to put it diplomatically, less aggressive about fair value treatment than Western standards. Assets didn't always have to be marked to market. Losses could be deferred. The rules created windows, timing gaps where a sophisticated finance team could maneuver bad assets into positions where they'd be dealt with later. Except later kept getting pushed forward. And here's the compounding nightmare of a cover-up like this. Every year you don't disclose, another year of financial statements becomes implicated. It's not just, we had losses in 1992. It's our 1,992, 1,993, 1,994, 1,995 statements were all wrong, and our auditor relationships and our board certifications, and every filing we made to regulators. The longer it goes, the more catastrophic disclosure becomes. So the cover-up becomes self-sustaining, not just because people are protecting themselves from embarrassment, but because the entire credibility structure of the company is now riding on the secret staying buried. Revelation isn't a scandal anymore. It's a collapse. This is why it lasted 20 years. And it's why, when a new CEO started asking the wrong questions, the response wasn't a conversation. It was removal. Michael Woodford joined Olympus in 1987, British, worked his way up through the European operations. By any measure, a company man. He knew the business. He delivered results. And in April 2011, Olympus's board made him president and COO, and then, just 6 months later, promoted him to CEO. This was already unusual. Olympus was a deeply traditional Japanese corporation, the kind of institution where seniority matters, where consensus is sacred, where disputes are handled quietly and internally, and where the idea of a non-Japanese executive sitting at the top of the table was, to put it mildly, a cultural disruption. His presence alone challenged the hierarchy, not because anyone said so out loud, but because the entire system of relationships, deference, and informal power that kept the company running was built around people who had come up together, who understood the unspoken rules, who knew what questions you don't ask. Woodford didn't know what questions he wasn't supposed to ask, so he asked them. In September 2011, a Japanese financial magazine called Facta published an article raising concerns about Olympus's acquisition history, specifically the advisory fees and the tiny company purchases. The article was largely ignored in the mainstream financial press. But Woodford read it, and then he read it again. He commissioned an independent review from PricewaterhouseCoopers. The findings were alarming. He wrote a series of letters to Olympus's chairman, Tsuyoshi Kikukawa, demanding explanations. He wanted to know where the money went. He wanted to know who authorized it. He wanted to know why the fees were so large. The responses he got back were evasive, vague, dismissive. On October 14, 2011, Woodford was called into a board meeting. He expected a conversation. What he got was a vote. The board removed him as CEO by a unanimous decision. The stated reason was that he had ignored the company's management style and was not aligned with the company's management philosophy. He had been CEO for exactly 14 days after the letters. He walked out of that building with a security escort and a one-way plane ticket to London. Now, here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. After Woodford was removed, Olympus's initial strategy was to simply wait it out. Kikukawa issued a statement defending the acquisitions. Several board members gave interviews suggesting Woodford had been a disruptive presence who didn't understand Japanese corporate culture. The implication was clear. This was a management-style disagreement, not a financial scandal. And for a moment, it almost worked. Japanese media was initially cautious. The stock dropped sharply. Olympus lost about 50% of its value in a matter of weeks, but the company was still standing. The board was still in place. The executives who knew the truth were still in their chairs. But Woodford didn't go home and stay quiet. He went to the Serious Fraud Office in the UK. He went to the FBI. He went to every journalist who would listen. He gave interviews, named names, described the transactions in detail. He made the story impossible to ignore. And then the walls came down. By November 2011, Kikukawa had resigned. The independent investigation that followed was devastating. The investigators concluded that the cover-up had been orchestrated by a small group of senior executives over nearly 2 decades with the explicit purpose of concealing investment losses from the bubble era. The total amount hidden, approximately $1.7 billion. Olympus restated years of financial results. Multiple executives were arrested and convicted. The company faced massive fines. Its stock, which had been trading above 2,700 yen before the scandal broke, fell to under 500 yen at its lowest point. And Woodford? He eventually received a substantial settlement from Olympus after filing a wrongful dismissal claim. He wrote a book about the experience. He became one of the most cited examples of corporate whistleblowing in modern business history. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The scheme didn't survive because everyone at Olympus was corrupt. It survived because the structure of the organization made it nearly impossible for the right people to connect the right dots. Information was compartmentalized. The executives who knew about the hidden losses controlled the flow of information. People who might have noticed discrepancies, and some did notice, found themselves blocked by process. That's not your remit. That's handled by a different division. That's above your level. You didn't need to threaten people. You just needed to make sure they never had access to the full picture at the same time. This is the thing that should unsettle you most about this story. It wasn't a conspiracy of villains in a dark room. It was a system that had been running so long it had become normal. Executives who joined after the cover-up began had no idea what they were inheriting. Auditors filed things under legitimate-looking categories because the paperwork looked legitimate. The machine produced its own cover, and the financial intermediaries, the deal facilitators, the advisors, the entities that sat between Olympus and the final destination of the money, most of them have never been household names. These weren't the big banks, these were specialists. People whose business model was knowing how to make sensitive transactions look routine. Fraud at this level isn't improvised. It's professionally packaged. If you found this story as fascinating as I have, there's something worth knowing about what it actually changed. Olympus became a reference case, not just in Japan globally. Business schools teach it, governance researchers cite it. The scandal forced a serious conversation in Japan about board independence, about whistleblower protections, about whether a corporate culture built on consensus and deference was structurally incapable of catching its own corruption. Reforms came. Slowly. But they came. Japan introduced stronger whistleblower protection laws. Pressure increased on major corporations to add independent outside directors to their boards. The Tokyo Stock Exchange updated its corporate governance code. None of this happened in a straight line, and none of it was solely because of Olympus. But Olympus was the case that made the abstract concrete. When people asked, could this happen at a major Japanese company? After 2011, the answer was no longer theoretical. And there's one final detail that I think captures the whole thing better than any number does. When investigators reconstructed the timeline of the cover-up, they found that the original decision to hide the losses, the very first step was made by people who genuinely believed it was temporary. They thought the markets would recover. They thought they'd be able to quietly unwind the positions before anyone noticed. They thought it would be a short-term problem with a short-term solution. That was in the early 1990s. It took until 2011 for the truth to come out. 20 years. Nearly $2 billion. And all it took to finally break it open was one man who didn't know which questions he wasn't supposed to ask. If you want to go deeper on corporate fraud and the systems that enable it, the Enron collapse, the Wirecard scandal, the way auditors can miss things that seem obvious in hindsight, those videos are right here. Each one follows a different thread, but they all pull at the same knot. And if you've made it this far, drop a comment with what surprised you most. Was it the advisory fee structure? The tiny acquisitions? The fact that it lasted 20 years? I read every single one. And honestly, the comments on stories like this are half the reason I keep making them. Subscribe if you want more. New video drops every week. The machine kept running for 2 decades. One guy with a briefcase of questions shut it down in 14 days.